Dr. Roberts is in the Department of Biology, and you are are you a cancer biologist? I keep saying that.
Yeah, sure.
She's a cancer biologist, and she's going to talk about ways of knowing in the natural sciences. So this is the last in our three-part series of UNE professors talking about ways of knowing in different disciplinary areas. Thanks a lot.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. How are you doing?
Good.
You're very brave to be here on the Friday of the last day of classes at 3 o'clock.
Just signed up for your class last night.
Did you?
Yeah.
Great. That'll be great. Then I'll see you next
What
semester.
class? Thank you.
Anatomy,
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know
That's good. Me too. It's all fun.
that. Dope.
So what I'm supposed to be talking with you about today is ways of knowing in science. So I understand that you've had 2 previous talks about ways of knowing in other disciplines. And how many of you are interested in actually going into science-related fields, actually? Okay, but a couple of holdouts. So what other fields, like what kind of field would you be going into? If you're not going to be into science,
I'd probably into PT.
PT. Oh, that's science-related? Okay, and how about you?
It'll be
Oh, that's science-related? Oh, you guys can have your hands up too.
Oh,
Yeah, so they're all science-related. Okay, right? Everybody else raise your hand? Okay, so you have an appreciation for some science, right, already? And I thought that we would talk about how we figure out what we're going to study in science, how we know that what we're studying is actually true, and why it's important for you as students and then for you as just members of society to actually know these things. So I have a couple of examples I'm going to hand out in a little bit, but I thought we would start by answering 4 questions. One of them is, what do we know about science in particular? How do we know these things? Who needs to know them? And so I'm extending the questions that maybe you've dealt with before. And then why is it important to know? So hopefully we'll get to all of those by the time we're done here. All right, so the first thing I thought I would ask you is, how do you find out scientific information? When you think to yourself, I'm wondering what DNA is, where do you go to look that up?
Internet.
The internet? Google? See, I knew that would be your first thing. The first thing you do is Google. Would anyone go to a textbook and look it up?
No.
Well, if I had a textbook, then,
But you don't bother with the textbooks?
well, I mean,
usually?
like, I don't have any science textbooks currently, but I could be thinking of it, about how.
Okay, so then you just Google.
Well, actually, we go to that academic search complete from my finals.
That's good. Okay, academic search complete. All right, so that's what I thought. I thought you might come up with Google, but I put textbook first just in case someone said that, but that's all right. And then I thought, all right, well, you might go to Google. See, I've been hanging out here at UNE long enough to know that that's one of the answers. And another one that I knew that you'd never come up with, but I put up here anyway, is scientific research articles. That's a really good place to find out scientific information, and I'm hopefully going to convince you why that is by the time that we're done. So there's a couple of different types of scientific research articles, and we'll go through those. So the first thing I would start with is an example. If I'm going to ask you, what's the function of the nucleus? What's going on in the nucleus in a cell? You would tell me what? It's like the brain of the cell, right? What's the big important thing that's inside the nucleus?
DNA.
Oh, good. Yes, DNA. That's right. And so DNA replication is happening inside there. That's one important place in the cell. What if I ask you what's going on with the mitochondria? What's the role of the mitochondria in cells?
I'm not saying it.
I heard you discuss this in
I'm not
class.
saying that.
That's why I brought it up.
Powerhouse of the cell.
Powerhouse of the cell. That's right. It's probably the title of the whole section of the chapter about mitochondria is powerhouse of the cell, right? So it makes what important thing for energy? What's the name of the energy that we get?
Sugar. Glucose.
Glucose. But well, glucose is where you make the energy out of, but what the name of the energy is, it's got 3 letters.
ATP.
ATP.
Oh,
Right,
oh.
ATP.
Hanging
See,
fire.
don't leave, man, don't leave.
I didn't have it.
I know, but you have such camaraderie. It's so good. Okay, so if the mitochondria are important for making energy, making ATP, what else do you know about the mitochondria? Anything? Is there anything particularly special about the mitochondria that you know? Making powerhouse of the cell. That's the number one thing. So that's what they teach you in textbooks. Every time you open a textbook, the part about mitochondria is makes ATP. But if you do some digging around and read maybe in the scientific literature, you would find that actually the mitochondria, so this is your answer, they make ATP for the cell. But actually, mitochondria play a role in two really, really important things in your body. One of them is called apoptosis. Does anybody know what apoptosis is? Have you heard of that before? Yeah?
Is that when they destroy cells?
Yeah, very good.
Oh my God.
Yes,
Get me
destroy
fired.
cells. It's called programmed cell death. And it is something where the cells in your body are programmed on purpose to die. So you think of yourself, okay, I'm alive, all my cells are alive, so all my cells must stay alive all the time. But actually an important part of what's going on in your body is that the cells are dying appropriately. If they don't die when they're supposed to, things like cancer would result because it's an overgrowth of cells. You need cells to be turning over all the time and being replaced by new cells. So apoptosis is the process by which old cells are gotten rid of. And when you're developing, like little babies are developing, your brain, and at that time, it has millions and millions of neurons, right? Billions and billions of neurons. But actually, do you have any idea how many of those neurons end up remaining in your brain by the time you're an adult?
1%.
That's a good guess. It's about
2%.
25. It's low, you're right, a lot of them are not there. It's about 50%. A good 50% of your neurons are completely gotten rid of by apoptosis by the time the brain is finished developing. So that's one way that apoptosis is important. Another way is replacing the cells that line your intestines. They have to be turning over all the time. The T cells that are in your body that fight infections, those have to be turning over all the time. And this is another example. So when your fingers are developing during development, fetal development, the hands start developing in a kind of more of a chunk like this, like in the left picture, and then during development, the cells that are in between where the fingers will die by programmed cell death or apoptosis. So this process is actually sculpting the digits, and that's how you end up with fingers in people. Or here, this is a developing mouse paw. It happens to be stained green in this picture, but cells are dying. That's the way it's sculpted. So it's like as if a sculptor was taking a chunk of clay and taking out the parts that they don't need to make the figure that they're trying to make. So that's what apoptosis is. And guess what? So you're saying, what does that have to do with mitochondria? Actually, has a lot to do with mitochondria because the whole process of apoptosis is carried out, initiated at least, by the mitochondria. So here's your mitochondrion, powerhouse of the cell, right? And it's making ATP. But when a cell needs to undergo programmed cell death, a hole is punched in the outer membrane of the mitochondria, and all this stuff called cytochrome C leaks out into the cytosol of the cell and starts this process that ultimately leads to apoptosis. And so these are the kinds of things you would learn in an upper division class like cell biology, or my class cancer biology, or we do a little bit of an AMP, if you're taking AMP. But in an early version of a textbook where you're just learning basic biology, all you know is powerhouse of the cell. But isn't this much cooler? Wouldn't you say, wow, I'm way more interested in cells and mitochondria now that I know that it's involved in programmed cell death? It's much more important, I think, to know that. That's a much more interesting thing. Okay, so that's something, if you read the scientific literature, you would find out that mitochondria are important for apoptosis as well as generating energy for the cell. So another thing that's important about mitochondria is mitochondrial DNA. Did you know that there's DNA in mitochondria? Did you know that? So do you know where mitochondria evolved from?
No.
Have you ever heard of how they're taken, it's a evolutionarily conserved bacterium that was engulfed by cells early on? You've heard that before, right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so the idea is that it's a bacterium that's taken up and it became part of eukaryotic cells, and it now serves to provide energy for us and carry out apoptosis. But actually it is a holdover from these older days of yore where the bacterium actually first was engulfed by the first eukaryotic cells. So as part of that, it has its own DNA, its own chromosome, and there are mutations that are in the mitochondrial DNA, and they are linked to diseases. So having DNA in your mitochondria is an important thing, and then having DNA that's not mutated in your mitochondria is really important too. So you didn't know that either, right? Mitochondria, 2 more new important things you didn't even know about. So I thought I would bring those up as things that are important for knowing that we know about science that you might not know unless you did a little bit more digging beyond what you might find in a quick Google search or in your textbook. And it also gives you some reason to keep going in science because you realize that some of the coolest things you learn in the upper classes, not in the intro classes. Okay, so then I thought we would think about how we know what we know about science. And I thought we'd also could talk about where you would go to find out information like this. So have you heard of PubMed before as a searching engine? So you said, what did you say before? EBSCO? No. What are you doing? Academic Search Complete, that's one. Academic Search Complete. Okay, that's one database you can search. This is another one that we use in medical sciences to look up current literature on whatever topic we're looking at. So I did a search on breast cancer, and it gives you different articles that were written about this by other scientists, and you can read them and compare. If you're a scientist, you can compare what you're doing to what other people are doing, or you can just read about a particular topic and learn more about it. And another place you can learn about stuff is Up to Date. This is a database that we have access to here through our UNA library. It's very, very powerful. If you need to know anything about a particular medical disorder, how it's treated, what the symptoms of it are, this is a great place to go. So you can all go practice this at home tonight, right? That's what you're gonna do on Friday night, is go look up to date and look up all of your maladies and try to figure out what's wrong. But this one, you could just search and I put in treatments for ear infections, and you can click on everything you wanted to know about it. So these are ways that you can find reputable information about a particular topic. So where did we get this information originally? We get it from experiments, right? If I ask you, how do you know about science? How do you know in like Bio 104 lab? How do you know that the cricket, don't you do something with crickets? You cool them off?
Put them on the respirometer.
Put them on the respirometer, and you measure how much respiration they're doing, and you cool off the temperature.
You put them in ice, yes.
You put them in ice, right? Yeah. So it's this experiment that you're doing to try to figure out the metabolic rate of the cricket, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay. So
How temperature affects the metabolic
how
rate.
temperature affects the metabolic rate. Right. Yeah. So you've done an experiment. You know what I'm talking about. That's how we find out all this stuff about science, is we do experiments. What's an important part of the experiments that you did with the crickets? What you do your measurements, but then you compared it to something else, a control. So a control is a really, really important part of science, and that's part of how we can know that something is actually true. So you have to do your experiments with controls. So if I want to see if a particular drug, if I inject it into mice, if it will cure cancer in the mice. So the mice have tumors, and I take one group of mice and I give them the drug that I think is going to cure cancer, and the other group of mice I give some control like saline or something that's not, doesn't have any drug in it, and I compare them. Because if I just injected them with just the drug alone, I wouldn't have anything to compare them to. Yeah.
Now, how do the mice get cancer?
Well, we would give them tumor cells. Yes.
Is that ethical?
Yes.
Okay.
It's all carefully controlled. That's a good question. Yes. We do it for the good of science, and we make sure that the mice are not suffering in any way.
Do they live?
Excellent question. Sometimes they live longer than others.
Oh.
Yes. If our drug works, then they live much longer. That's right. So we would need to do controls to compare the drug to, right? Another thing did you do any statistics in your bio lab to analyze it?
Like graphs and stuff?
You did some graphs, yeah, and did you do like averages
Yeah,
and standard deviations?
I think
Oh
so.
yeah, right? So
Sure.
that's statistics. That's another way that we know that what we're doing in science is actually true or valid. The observations that we had are valid, right? Okay, so if those two things are important, how do you know, let's say that you get a result that this drug that you injected into mice was really effective. How do you know that, and that maybe somebody else might not have had the same observation before, that someone else hasn't discovered that before? Where would you go to figure that out? I've already told you where you could go. Google. Oh man, it's always Google.
PubMed?
Up to date.
Up to date, or the one before that.
Abstracts.
Pub something.
PubMed,
Yeah.
that's right. So I would go, as a scientist, I would go to PubMed and look up the name of my drug and mouse tumor, and I would get a bunch of papers from people who've done this before. And then I would sit down and read all those papers and compare what I've observed in my own hands, in my own lab, to what other people have seen before, right? So that's how I would also be able to convince myself that what I've observed and documented is actually true. So that's an important part of science, is comparing what you know to what other people have already done. All right. So that is part of reproducibility of the experiments. So I need to look and see in a literature search using PubMed or some other similar search engine that other people have been able to find the same thing, or maybe that what I've done at least seems similar and then extends what other people have found before. So on top of that, I have to make sure I can repeat the experiment again. What if I just didn't give the mice enough tumor cells in the first group compared to the other group? Then that I can't tell for sure that the reason that the tumors didn't grow as much is because I forgot to inject them with tumor cells or something. So I need to do it again on a different day to make sure I get the same result. And I also need to compare what I got to what other people have found before. So that's all about reproducibility of the experiments, right? Okay. So then, the next thing is, compared to the published literature, that's what I'm talking about. And then, so how do you know that what's published already is actually valid itself? Like when you compare it to something else, how do you know that what they did was real? And part of the process of something becoming published in science, that it would appear on PubMed, for example, is that it goes through a process of peer review. Have you done peer review in your class? Right? You have. So you know what I'm talking about. It's very similar to that, yeah.
Don't they allow only like so many like publications a year or something like that?
Yeah, each journal will only publish a certain number, whatever they would maybe publish 10 articles every month or something.
Oh.
And so then they only take the very best ones. That's right. So if they decide that your paper is worth reading and thinking about, they might send it to other scientists that belong to their editorial board, and they read it, and they decide if your research is actually worth like reading about more and even worth publishing. So during that process of peer review, there's a lot of communication back and forth between the scientists who originally did the experiments and their new discoveries of developing the new cancer drug that cured cancer in mice, and then the editors as well as the reviewers that read their paper. And that back and forth correspondence requires clear writing skills. It requires reading published literature, referring to published literature, and basically orienting your own study within what is already known, that's already been published. So I thought I would show you a couple of examples from my own work. This is how peer review, this is an example of how peer review might go in science. So this is a correspondence about research that we submitted for publication a few years ago. And so we actually write a formal letter, and so we're not writing a paper, we're not writing a research article, a research paper, like a term paper, but we're writing scientifically, and we're writing in a way that is clear to the other people what we're trying to tell them about, why our work is interesting and important, and why they should publish it. So once we sent the paper to them, they then say, okay, it was kind of interesting, but there's a whole bunch of things that we don't like about it. We think that the experiment you did this way, we don't like your control. Or we think you needed to test it in more mice first. Or have you tried this other drug? Or have you compared this to what other people have done in this field? So they write back to you. So you send the paper to them, they read it, they decide if there's some questions about it, and then they send them back. And then this is an example of what would happen when you resubmit the paper back to them. You fix it up according to what they didn't like about it. So it's like the second round of your reviews for your papers that you've probably written in English class, right? So you gave your paper to your peer, they commented on it, and then you took it back and you modified your paper according to what they said, right? Right? Maybe? Some of what they said. And so that's what we're doing here. So we said, we're giving you our revised manuscript, and we revised it according to the way that the reviewers responded to it, and these are some of the things that they said. So we said that they didn't like the way we were doing our controls, so we responded, and the blue stuff is what we wrote back to them, that we think our controls are fine, and this is why we think they're fine. And here they say, well, we don't like the way that your percentages worked out, and we say, oh, well, actually, it's explained this way, you just didn't see that. And then down here, they say, okay, well, actually, in someone else, see right here, this is a reference to another paper that's been published. They say, well, actually, someone else has already done something like this. You should really be, it's probably their own paper. And they say, well, you should really be mentioning this. And so we comment on that and say it's actually not relevant to our study, or maybe it is, and we'll revise our manuscript accordingly. So this is the process of going back and forth with a paper to say, so that as a group of scientists really end up working on it, the people who originally did the work, as well as the people who read it, comment on it, and it gets molded into something that has been reviewed by many, many scientists who have a lot of knowledge and who can say with confidence in the end, when this paper does get published, that this is something that represents good science, accurate work, and something that is really scientifically true, as far as we can tell, based on all the controls and statistics and reviews that we did, okay? Do you understand the process of peer review a bit, what I'm saying about that? So when you see a paper that's published, it's gone through many rounds of back and forth already, yeah.
So I just want to, I love that you're making connections to the peer review process in the, sort of say, the freshman level.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it fascinating, the first two anyways. I couldn't see the second or third one. I mean, I can see it now, but I couldn't at the time.
Okay.
But I love the first two because they're sort of like, hey, thanks a lot, but you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, how many times have you had that experience, right? So a peer reviewer has made a comment about something and you've looked at it and you're like, it's a good point, but actually I don't think I'm going to go with that. And I think that's really important, right? Peer review is not just, oh, you told me to fix it and so I'm going to fix it. I love the way you present it. It's a conversation. It's an interactive kind of thing where we're working to shape a set of ideas to present them in the most effective way, in the clearest way.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a communication back and forth, and being able to communicate clearly in order to have that conversation is really important. So the next thing that I thought I would talk about is, you say, right now you're thinking, oh man, why is she talking about scientists? I don't want to be a scientist. I don't care. Why would I care about writing a scientific article, right? So then I would say back to you, all right, well, who else would need to know this kind of scientific information? I would say that anybody in the scientific field, so not just scientists, but physicians, nurses, and if a physician is referring a patient from their own office to another patient, they have to write a letter that describes that patient's condition and what they've done, what tests they've run on them, and be able to convey that to the other physician. If it's a nurse, they might need to write discharge notes about a patient and send them along to a different hospital. So people in other fields write also, and they have to write scientifically and write clearly. And then another thing is that you don't necessarily have to be a scientist at all, or even a science-related field. So not only is it scientists, physicians, nurses, but I would argue that even as a voter or as a parent or anyone in the country should have an idea of knowing about science and how to learn about it and how to know what's really true about science. So you don't have to necessarily be a scientist. You just need to know about what is out there in science and be able to judge for yourself what is actually accurate. So that's kind of where I'm headed next. The idea is that what you're thinking about voters, why would you think that a voter would need to know something about science? Can you think of an example? Yeah.
Abortion?
Right, so knowledge about abortion, that's a good example. So being able to vote appropriately on what you think is true. That's also got moral issues as well as scientific issues, but yeah, that's a good example of things that people vote about. Something else that would be science related that people might vote about, that they need to have some basic science knowledge for.
Evolution in an elementary school or middle school or high school textbook?
Yeah, that's a great one, right. So yeah, whether we're teaching evolution or not, right. And people are voting on that, whether they want to have that taught in their schools or not. Any other ideas?
What about stem cell research?
That's a great example. Yeah, stem cell research. That's right. So people need to be informed about it to know whether they want to reject it or not. Maybe it's something that's worth pursuing because we can get medical treatments from it and medical advances. Or maybe it's not worth pursuing and it's really wrong to do. Like, that's something that you need to be able to judge for yourself based on scientific data. That's right. There's also stuff about whether genes should be patentable. There's been a lot of discussion about this, particularly last year. There was a big Supreme Court decision about the fact that genes could be patentable under some conditions and not patentable under other conditions. And while you may not vote directly on that, you might vote for the people who end up making those decisions, and so that's important. Should genetic testing be paid for everybody? Should people be able to take their genome and have it sequenced and find out whether they have breast cancer susceptibility genes? Should everybody be able to do that? Should it be paid for by the government? Should it be paid for by people's health insurance? Like, that kind of policy making happens through us having an idea of what's valid and appropriate for science to contribute to the greater good. So those are all examples of things. And then the last one is parents. So that's a picture of me with my son. I thought I would put that in because I was Googling for random pictures of stuff to make things more interesting. And I was like, why am I going to put up a picture of someone else and their baby? So I just put up a picture of myself and my baby. So that's him. He's 6 now, but that's him. So now I'm going to tell you about why I think that parents actually need to be informed too, as an example of science. So you don't have to be a scientist for it to be important for you to know about science. But I would say that everybody should be scientifically literate and be able to figure out what is valid information and what is not valid information. So that allows you to be an informed voter, like I was talking about before, to be an informed patient if you're going to see your physician, to go in with some idea of what kind of options you have besides what they might be telling you, and to be able to judge scientific information for yourself. So does anybody know who that is on the bottom? Jenny. That is Jenny McCarthy, that's right. Do you know who she is? No? No idea. Okay. Yeah, so I thought you would know. So she's posed in Playboy, and she's a actress of sorts, I guess. I don't know, that's why she's famous. But what I know her most for is for her anti-vaccine stance. So she thinks that children should not be vaccinated, that it's dangerous for them, and that it's not healthy, and that scientists are out to get children, and the medical people shouldn't be trusted. That's basically the gist of it. So I put her up there as an example of why you might want to be able to make decisions for yourself so that you can decide when someone like Jenny McCarthy is giving you information. You have to think to yourself, okay, well, what's her frame of reference? Does she have any scientific knowledge? And what can I decide for myself based on what I can look up on PubMed or in some kind of informed search? So this is an example that I got of a blog from a pro-vaccination website. And it's a story that a woman writes about how she originally didn't vaccinate her children because she thought it was dangerous and that she shouldn't do it. And she was basically getting all of her information from her friends. And she was getting her information from people like Jenny McCarthy on the internet, even though Jenny McCarthy doesn't have any medical or scientific background really to speak of. So she writes on the bottom of the first page, I didn't understand much of what I read, but it did sound pretty scary. I looked up the prevalence of diseases today and realized that nobody had even caught diphtheria for years. So why should she vaccinate her children, right? But she realizes in the next paragraph, my research was very skewed. I was going into it with preconceived ideas. So her first child, she doesn't immunize with anything. And she had a second child. She goes on to talk about that. And she had learned that vaccines weren't safe and lots of other things about how they were bad. And then on the third page, there's a picture of all the, actually put this on the slide, there's a picture of all the statistics about the diseases that are being vaccinated against. So her anti-vaccine people had told her that safety studies were lacking, but she was able to find lots of studies that showed safety of vaccines with just a few PubMed searches. Oh, isn't that cool how she used PubMed? So that is a way that she could get valid, accurate scientific information and then take that information and judge it for herself. So what she found is documented up here that this is showing the cases of these horrible diseases like diphtheria and polio before vaccines were introduced, and then versus after vaccines were introduced. So the red basically goes away on the right side, which helps to show you that the vaccines do indeed have an effect on making these diseases go away in our population. Then, on the next page, she talks about how people had told her that vaccines were bad for your immune system and that you really shouldn't be giving your children so many things that their immune system should be looking at. It's too much for them, it's overloading them. And so then she said, okay, well actually, I looked that up for myself and I found out that in 1983, children were exposed to 15,000 antigens by the time they're 4 years old. And now in our current vaccines, there are more diseases covered, and there's only 400 antigens that they're introduced to by the time they are 5. So this is exactly opposite of what she'd been told by people who may or may not have had a valid scientific background to convey information about this topic. So I thought that this was a good example of why you should be able to take science, analyze it for yourself, and think about it in your own way and not necessarily rely on what other people are saying, and think about what the source is that you're getting the information from. So in the end, at the bottom of this fourth page, it says, in the end, I couldn't continue to deny the science. And that is basically goes along with what I'm trying to give you an idea of, is that these science, the knowledge of science and why, or what we know about science is important not only for scientists to know, and maybe physicians and nurses to know also, but also just as a person in our country who's going to be voting, who's going to be out in the world raising children maybe someday, that everybody needs to be scientifically literate and be able to know about science in enough of a level to be able to judge this stuff for themselves. So that's basically what I wanted to tell you about, and I thought maybe if you have any questions about this or you want to talk about anything more about it, we can do that too. Okay? All right. Any other thoughts?
Question?
Yeah.
What was that, like, what does it mean, like, so 15,000
I know, I thought of that right after I said it. I thought I should have explained what antigens mean. So the idea, when you give a vaccine, you put in little pieces of the virus or the bacterium that you're immunizing against, and you put it into the person's arm or wherever, and you're doing that so that the immune system gets the first look at it. And then the idea is that then the immune system will remember it, because the immune system has memory, and the next time the child encounters that particular virus or bacterium, they will be able to recognize it quickly and more powerfully than they would have if they'd never seen it before. So the things that you actually put into the person are antigens. That's the name of the things that your immune system can see. They're called antigens. And so when they say that, that means that there were 15,000 of them given versus 400.
So that sounds like it's better.
The right one? Well, that is a good question. Yes, you're right. It does sound like it's better. So if it's better in a way because you're covering more stuff is what you're saying, right? But some people have thought, and I think that it's pretty commonly believed, that if you give people too many things, it sort of dilutes out the immune response. So maybe they can't possibly have a really strong immune response against everything. But if you limit it to just a few things, then they can have a better immune response against just those few things. So this supports the idea that we can actually cover more diseases with more advanced vaccines that have maybe less antigens in them, but that are more powerful. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
That makes much more sense.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, since in particular here we're looking at biomedical research, at the pressure that money puts on research?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that we're, in the natural sciences in particular, there's this there's a method that overlaps with interested or application-driven work and non-interested application-driven work. That's the suggestion, is that the so-called scientific method this is the disinterested pursuit of truth and knowledge that sometimes can lead to, intentionally or not, to applications. But some research isn't ever looking over the horizon to a possible application. And that research, my understanding is, has a very hard time getting funded as a general rule, although it still does sometimes, because institutions that can afford to support so-called basic science do. But much of, as I understand it, much of the research in biology in particular that will succeed in getting funded is research that has the promise of an application. So whether it's the promise of increasing the efficiency of a fishery, or whether it's the promise of, in particular, a drug or an expensive procedure, hopefully, that can eliminate a cancer. On the one hand, that's good news. We should want solutions to problems. On the other hand, I was a little bit, so could you maybe tell us a little bit about, is it enough to just turn to PubMed? Because my understanding in particular about biomedical research, the kind of meta-studies have been done, are very dispiriting in terms of what they suggest about the integrity of the journals and of the peer review process for very well-respected journals. So in other words, is it enough to just go to PubMed and to trust that there's been peer review? What else can I do in looking at that article? Do the journals insist on a disclosure policy on the relationship between the researcher and the funding? And what's it like for you in the field? Where do you feel that? What's it like to know in the natural sciences as a biomedical researcher? Where, if at all, do you feel that tension between not just the need to develop an application, but to deliver results that will get funded?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a scientist, I have seen it I've read papers where they're studying worms. So C. elegans is a model organism. A lot of people use it. It's very basic science. And they feel compelled in their first paragraph of their paper to relate the death of the worms in the paper to heat stroke and global warming in order to get their research published.
Right.
Because it makes it have a bigger impact, and it makes it just something that people are going to be more interested in, so they're going to get it published in a higher tier journal. So there's always that pressure to relate whatever you're doing to some kind of medical research just to get it published, never mind funded. So that definitely exists. And then kind of related to that, the other part of what I think you're talking about is the disclosures of whatever financial considerations might be at play with as far as whatever someone is investigating.
Right.
So I've recently been trying to get a paper published from some older work that I had done, and I was astounded by now, it's about 5 years since I submitted a paper, and I was astounded at how much more emphasis there is nowadays, even just 5 years later, on disclosing disclosing, what do you call it? Conflicting, what's the word? Conflict of interest. Disclosing conflict of interest, thank you. There's a lot of paperwork that goes into that, as well as the disclosing where you get your funding, and also where you have your human subjects and animal subjects being covered. Like, there's just a lot more paperwork and showing your trail of where you're coming from than there ever was before that I remember. So I think that there's more emphasis on that, and journals now are disclosing right at the top under the author list, or right at the very bottom of the first page of the article, these authors do declare a conflict of interest and they have stock in blah 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 company, and or they get funding from the National Center for getting paid to develop drugs or whatever it is. So they put that right out there on the front page. So it helps you to judge the work. So if you look at the paper that you're reading and you see that this is a new drug for, I don't know, multiple sclerosis or something, and the person is getting money from Pfizer to do that research, you might read it a little bit differently than you would someone who's getting funding from the National Institutes of Health or something that would be considered less financially driven, although there still are conflicts there too. But it would be it's definitely part of what you're reading is where the people came from and where they're getting their funding. So it's all there in the paper, and journals do disclose that now, and the authors have to disclose it. But it's definitely something that you have to look at and can take into consideration. Yeah.
So in a way, they're trying to advertise.
They're not really trying to advertise. They're trying to say, if I am telling you that this drug is the best drug in the whole world, it's not because I have stock in the company that makes the drug, because then I would make lots of money off of it. It's because I really believe that this is real science, and here's my data that suggests that this is really true, and it's the best possible cancer drug we've ever come up with before. So it's pure science versus like financially motivated science. But you could argue that any science is sort of financially motivated because the person who is doing the science is getting paid to do it, and they need to ensure that they have a job. So there's also some motivation there. So it can get ugly. But as far as the basics, you have to judge it based on where they're getting their funding, I think. And that's part of what you're reading, for sure. So where else could you get information besides PubMed? Is that another thing that you're wondering about too?
No, I'm thinking of an article I read in the Atlantic Monthly
Mhm.
a couple of years ago. Some scholar has got a team, and with biomedical research in particular, and they've gone and
Oh, I think I know what you're
they actually have the chops to and it was really demoralizing.
Yeah.
What percentage of articles they estimated
Mhm.
are not scientifically sound? I mean, it was in the
Yeah.
90% range.
Yeah, if they're looking at statistics too, there's a lot of criticisms of
Well, I mean,
statistics.
this was, so this
in
is to
general.
say that simply because, in other words, it just, when you say go to PubMed and then you know it's science,
Mhm.
I mean, then you know it's a claim that's being made
Mhm.
for, I think that would be, from what I can, I mean, it could be otherwise. Put it differently, I mean, what's it like to be a scientist, to have to pursue this way of knowing as a vocation, but also as a career? I imagine, but I don't know, that it's gonna be hard to get a career going if you have a lot of experiments that are inconclusive.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's pressure
There's
on the
pressure
research.
to get good data.
So, but we assume that science is taking place in a disinterested space in which what matters is the integrity of the method.
Yeah.
And that's true, but the context in which it's practiced and funded is a context which it doesn't seem to me allows for, as much inconclusiveness or uncertainty to emerge
Yeah.
as one might think if one taken Bio 104 and we hear about the scientific method and why it's to be celebrated.
Right.
It's-
No,
So, and
that's true.
I wonder if sometimes was behind some of the resistance, let's say, to vaccination. There's a mistrust that's grown up.
Yeah.
Sometimes not for the right reasons, but that if then they do get their hands on people who are qualified to do meta studies and to review the integrity of peer review processes, that unfortunately it doesn't withstand scrutiny very well.
Yeah.
And it isn't, it wouldn't necessarily be so.
I would say that particularly in this setting, the big contrast that I'm trying to make is between science in general, science that you find on PubMed, science that's peer reviewed by other scientists, and what you're just going to find with a Google search.
Oh, yeah.
And because you're going to go right to Jenny McCarthy's website if you search for anti-vaccine stuff. And
Sure.
she's going to tell you all about why she thinks that vaccines are terrible. And that's fine, she's entitled to her opinions, but then it's your job as a member of society, someone who hopefully by the time you're done college would be scientifically literate enough to judge that and say, where is her data that shows that? Show me the statistics that say that this causes, children to become sicker instead of better off. Whereas I would say you can find information on the CDC website that says that as people stop vaccinating their children, cases of whooping cough are skyrocketing in certain areas like California and Idaho where people aren't vaccinating their children anymore. And so there's data on that side that's pretty clear that's related to people not vaccinating anymore. So using vaccines as an example.
Well,
So yes,
Yeah.
but you have to consider where your information is coming from, but also I would say the science and the PubMed type of searches are still going to give you information and more information about how they got their information than Jenny McCarthy would, or some random person's blog. Yeah.
So, I know it's about time for me to wrap up, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna, maybe this is a question, maybe it's just a ramble here. But thinking about this little exchange in terms of, so what Professor Anderson is sort of asking is, he's sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, you know what, it seems like there is some evidence that in a lot of cases, more or less, maybe just a few, that scientists have a vested interest in certain sort of reporting certain outcomes of their research. And maybe because I'm paid by Pfizer, and I'm working on their blockbuster drug, right? And they're paying me, and I'm gonna publish that research that shows how great the blockbuster drug is. That gets published in a reputable journal. Maybe I'm good buddies with, and I took the guy out to dinner, and he happens to be the editor. These kinds of glad-handing relationships. And I think, and so what your response is, like you've seen in the last 5 years, that actually there's increasing disclosure of any potential conflict of interest at the front of these articles. And the thing I guess I want to say about that is, when we think about what we've read, and especially this thing, oh, by the way, if you haven't shared your paper with me yet, it's due today. One of the things you're engaging with in this final paper for the course, this question of rhetorical reading, right? And reading science rhetorically and reading text rhetorically, having that conflict of interest information, that potential conflict of interest information available, enables scientists who are judging, right, who are saying, you know what, is that research I want to believe, right? Judging the validity of the findings, that helps them. That's not to say, oh, because Pfizer paid you that we're going to totally eliminate it. It's not valid. But it's additional important contextual information. When we think about what that means to read rhetorically, understanding the relationships, the context under which the science is happening, et cetera. And so, certainly there's a whole lot. This is sort of a, I like the way you put it, right? Sort of, if the choice is Jenny McCarthy or PubMed, I'm going to go with PubMed no matter what. And then once we're looking at PubMed, we can start to ask kind of questions about, wait a minute, what about that really basic research? What about that Ebola vaccine that was almost produced 20 years ago, but they decided there was no market for it in Africa, and so it sat on a shelf? And then we're flipped out 20 years later, and the company that developed it's like, yeah, there was no money in it, so we didn't put it into it, right? This speaks to this question about the financial interest. So that's my ramble. I don't know whether you want to say something as a last comment. There was there was a promising Ebola vaccine that they've been dusted. In fact, they're working on it now. They've dusted it off, and they're working on it now.
Good thing.
No, I think that's great. Context is everything for reading, for sure.
Maybe Jenny McCarthy's website would say, though, that she recanted. She backed off.
Has she backed off?
Yeah.
Oh, because there was something recently that happened. People
Her kid got whooping cough?
No,
I think her argument was that the increase in autism.
Yes, I didn't really want to say that and perpetuate that.
Yeah.
I was careful to.
You're trying to avoid
Yeah.
that thing that I just said. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah,
But she's since had to back off and
Yeah.
retreat from all of that, so.
yeah,
And to actually, whatever my son has came from this other thing.
right. Yeah. And I found a really good article about a woman who wrote about her daughter becoming autistic, even though she'd never vaccinated her, and how she thought she was going to end up with this child who was pure and natural and amazingly healthy, and how she ended up with a child who was autistic anyway, even though she had never vaccinated her. So these kinds of things are all anecdotal, but
Yeah.
still, it was it was on the same website actually. It was very interesting. So
But studying biology doesn't make you autistic.
sometimes.
Put you on the spectrum.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming on Friday.